Should you diversify your client acquisition tactics, or should you just focus on one and milk it for all that it's worth? Let's say you're really good with cold email. Should you put all your eggs in the cold email basket? My name is Michael Bohannes, and I run a six-figure agency and coaching business where we help consultants go beyond referrals and build client acquisition systems. And the thing is, if you are relying on referrals, then you are putting all of your eggs into the referral basket, which is very similar to having all of your investment money in one single stock. And this idea has helped me to develop this theory of how client acquisition has many similar characteristics to trading in the stock market and investing in general. So I'd like to elaborate on this today because far from just being philosophizing, I think it has a lot of good lessons that you can learn, especially about which pitfalls to avoid, because there's many mistakes that people make in investing. And if you can avoid the mistakes, then you might want to just do that. Because as Charlie Munger said, I want to know where I will die so that I never go there. A lot of business success is built on not on genius, but on plainly avoiding making stupid mistakes. So if you know where the pitfalls are, you're much more likely to avoid them. So let's get into it. There are many mistakes that people do in investing to lose all their money, but there are several ones that find a mirror image of themselves in the area of client acquisition. Number one, not diversifying. Number two, riding trends and not recognizing for what they are. Number three, not studying the fundamentals. Number four, overly relying on one provider. And number five, being too emotional. And to illustrate these mistakes, I have a cautionary tale of somebody who I know, let's call him Jack, who actually went through many of these mistakes himself, and I happen to know of him. I happen to know him a little bit, and I know the story. I'm not going to share his real name, so let's just call him Jack. But his story has a lot of these lessons, and it's a good example for what to avoid. Back in 2020 and 2021, Jack was riding high. He was making 50K, sometimes even more than that, as a solopreneur, using Facebook groups, Facebook organic content, and LinkedIn automation, scaled one-on-one messaging with people on LinkedIn as well as on Facebook. But the main thing was his Facebook group that he had grown to a considerable size. Well, within a few months, this tactic had gotten old. People joining Facebook groups and the owner then posting these types of high value posts. Hey, if you want this 38-page PDF of how I grew my business to 50K, just comment here and so on. This had gotten a little bit old and people were starting to get used to it, and it stopped being very effective. Also, organic traffic on Facebook was grinding to a halt. Facebook is pushing more and more people into its ad platform. And so any kind of reach that you could get on organic posts was getting less and less. And also crucially, LinkedIn in mid-2021 introduced the 100 maximum connections per week. And that completely obliterated the rest of his business because he was just relying on sending hundreds and hundreds of connection messages and then automating the DMing for them. And that alone would not have been the worst problem, but then also Jack got emotional. He suddenly pivoted, did something completely different, but he didn't have much experience in that. And he just believed that the tactics were completely not working anymore. So it was all a big mess, and he found himself with almost no revenue. So let's get into the individual 5 mistakes that you can make both in the stock market as well as in client acquisition. Let's try to see what are the lessons learned from Jack's story that we can kind of look at with a magnifying glass. So the number one mistake is not diversifying. What does it mean in stock market terms when you invest all of your money into a single stock? Well, you're running a really risky game because ultimately you're not in control of the company. And if all your money is invested on one single entity that can completely decline in value, you're obviously putting yourself at a huge risk. And that is why most people who invest in the stock market usually do it via funds. They simply put together a bunch of assets that are hopefully non-correlating so that in case the value of one goes down, maybe others go up at the same time so that overall you have stability, right? If you have one asset, it can go up and down in value. However, if you have another asset, it does not correlate with this. For example, technology companies tend to be highly correlated to each other. When Google does well, Apple does well, Amazon does well, and so on. So if you have these 3 companies, then you will see quite a bit of correlation, and you want to ideally be very opposed, i.e. having non-correlating assets. So for example, and I'm talking a little bit out of my depth here, but I would presume that, for example, Google as a high-tech company would be one good one, then a very traditional consumer business, let's say Coca-Cola or McDonald's, and then maybe some companies who mine natural resources, energy companies and the like. Those tend to be highly non-correlating assets. So you want to ideally have a diversified portfolio portfolio, where if one goes down, necessarily not the others go down as well. And so it's the same with client acquisition tactics. You also have to diversify in them, because if you are focusing on one single tactic and that stops working, then of course you're screwed. And it doesn't only have to be that it completely stops working. It can also be that it suddenly starts to become more and more expensive and your profits shrink. Let's take paid client acquisition as an example. If you have 95% of your business depending on paid client acquisition, and suddenly that becomes more and more expensive and your profits shrink, you're also in a pretty bad spot. You have not diversified sufficiently, and paid ads are generally becoming more and more expensive, and which decreases your profits. So you're putting yourself at a great risk here. So just like in the stock market, you have to diversify your client acquisition tactics. And this was coming back to the example of Jack. It was not really his biggest problem. He did have a couple of different tactics, but I see this with many, many consultants who are trying to win clients and try to build client acquisition systems. They tend to be very focused on either referrals or even repeat business, right? So they practically don't have any new client acquisition tactics. Or if they do, they're very much focused, for example, on organic content. Now, that's great. Organic content is really the way to go in the long run. But if you are not particularly good at it and you expect miracles from it, oh, I'm going to start posting it after 3 months. Oh, Jesus, still no clients. Well, you are putting all your eggs in one basket and you expect too much from that basket. So this happens a lot in the consulting space, that people have one, maybe two tactics where they do a little bit of conversational prospecting, but it's just very, very focused on one tactic, which is a problem. Okay, so that was problem one, not diversifying. Problem number two, focusing on trends and riding trends, not recognizing a trend for what it is. And famously in investing, of course, there's fads, right? There's these trends, these crazes. Like in 1636, I believe it was, the tulip mania in the Netherlands, where it was crazy. For some reason, people believed that tulips were a super valuable asset. And there were like crazy stories of how one tulip bulb was fetching a same price as the 100 times of the wages of a qualified worker in the Netherlands at the time. So completely crazy. But if you think that is particularly absurd, then let me remind you that only recently we had people paying millions of dollars for worthless pixels. So it's good to see that humanity hasn't learned all that much. And so in the client acquisition space, there's also fads and trends. There's always these surges of tactics that come and go, right? It started with SEO, Facebook groups, LinkedIn automation, chatbot, account-based marketing, you name it. Now, all of these are fine. They work in principle if you study them obsessively. But if you just jump on one trend after another, that is when it becomes a problem. Because then you know when their time has come and when it's time to exit. If you're just superficially riding a trend, well, then you will probably fall flat on your face. And this was the main mistake that Jack had made. He didn't realize that his success with Facebook groups was actually the tail end of the wave. He still got a good catch of the wave, but it was the last part of it. He was good at it, but he didn't see behind the curtain. He thought the party would last forever. Mistake number three is not studying the fundamentals. In investing, it's studying the fundamentals of a company that you want to invest in, or an industry, or a certain asset class. It's really studying it and understanding it from beginning to end. And that is what made Warren Buffett legendary, right? He famously sits down and reads the whole day and then makes one move per year, which then makes him billions. In client acquisition, what are the fundamentals? They are sales, psychology, copywriting, how to build long-term trust. Those are fundamental things that are completely tactic independent. Now, Jack didn't study the fundamentals, because if he had, he would have recognized that Facebook groups are simply a manifestation of community, which is an important way of giving people something valuable so that they build trust with you as the group provider. And you as the community leader then can kind of build long-term relationships in the long run. Jack didn't study that. He was just in a group to milk it for what it was worth. He didn't build a long-term community. Had he understood those fundamentals of community building, he wouldn't have crashed and burned. Jack was too much of a short-term thinker to recognize what was going on and how he could pivot from a tactic that had stopped working into something more durable. Mistake number four is overly relying on one provider or one platform. It's one thing to invest in one asset class, which to a large part is a fad and a trend, like for example, crypto. But it's just another layer in the shit sandwich if you also invest within that asset class. If you invest in one single platform, like every investor in FTX can attest to. Back to Jack here. Jack's tactics were very relying on the unique, intricate dynamics of Facebook and LinkedIn. He was just relying that Facebook would continue pushing organic content, and he was relying on LinkedIn not changing anything in how you were allowed to connect with other people on the platform, right? So he was very much platform locked in. Mistake number 5 in both investing and in client acquisition is getting emotional, panicking when something changes. When LinkedIn makes the algorithm change, oh my God, what am I going to do? In investing, it shows up as doom mongering, right? So when there's a bear market, the people, oh my God, I'm going to sell all my assets at the way lower price at the bottom of the market because I just think the world is coming to an end. So I want to salvage whatever I can, only for somebody to pick that up and ride the next bull market upwards. In Jack's case, his emotionally had 2 sides to it. First of all, he got too carried away by when the party was going strong, and he just lived the life, right? He started traveling and he partied a lot, and it was really nice apartments, and I believe that he bought a fancy car as well. So all of that was the emotional side of, the boom years, right? So let's be exuberant, let's spend a lot. And the flip side of the coin, the second aspect of his emotionality was then when you started seeing cracks in the whole system, then he started panicking. He was just kept hammering his old tactics, and when he saw that they stopped working, he made this frantic pivot into another business that he didn't have much experience in, and he then in the end found himself with very little revenue. And at that point, because of emotionality number 1, he hadn't built up a big enough financial cushion to weather those blows, right? You have to have reserves so that when something changes in the market, you can kind of retreat, regroup, and think what is happening, and then make your next move. He didn't have that. So I hope you learn a couple of useful lessons from Jack's story and see how these 2 things, the stock market on the one hand, generally investing, how it's very similar, because again, it's psychology based, how it's similar with client acquisition. So in summary, number 1, diversifying your client acquisition tactics. Don't just stick with one unless you really are in it for the long haul. You want to study it. You want to become like the best in the world at it, in which case you should have some financial reserves in case things don't go well. But generally, I strongly recommend you diversify your client acquisition tactics, because if one does not go very well, sometimes another one will, continue working. So you're effectively mitigating the losses, just like with a stock portfolio, you're mitigating the losses from one stock by the wins or stability in another stock. Number 2, don't fall for fads. And if you do ride a fad wave, recognize for what it is. Don't mistake it for the real thing, and be very paranoid with your savings. Build a cash cushion. Number 3, study the fundamentals, really understand human psychology, read sales books, study copywriting, because no matter where you sell, no matter which tactics you will be using, those fundamentals will carry you everywhere. Number 4, don't overly rely on one single platform, whether that's LinkedIn, YouTube, or Twitter. Not a good idea to just stick with one and make yourself beholden to their, algorithm changes and so on. And number 5, don't be emotional. Don't spend like crazy when you're riding the wave, so that you can, when the wave crashes, be sober in assessing what to do next. All right, if you like this, do the deed, like the video, subscribe to this channel, or recommend it to your friends, whatever it is. Please share this with other people, and I see you in the next video.